Now we're back in the studio having our first guest with us talking about the NATO alliance meeting taking place in Brussels today. And we are joined by Małgorzata Bonikowska, EU Foreign and Security Policy Expert, Center for International Relations. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Always a pleasure to have you. Let's look at some of the concrete details here. Already we've heard about this new fund, this fund for Ukraine, 100 billion euros or dollars, 5-year fund. This sounds like a great idea. But who's going to pay for it?
Well, it's a very important question and very important also initiative because, you know, we are facing really a crisis in the US. Ukraine doesn't have this money as of now. We don't know if this bill passes at all. So it has to be an alternative. Europe did our way. We accepted 50 billion euro help for 4 years for Ukraine, but this is more the help for the state, for the administration, all the costs to run the state. Now we are talking about a military aid, and we all know that Ukrainian army is having problems as of now. It is very unlike last year, where Ukrainian army was really advancing, and we were all thinking that it was really quite possible that they would really be able to push back the Russians. So now, facing these two problems, that Ukrainian army needs help, and also that we don't have enough money, I think this is a very right thing to start talking about. And of course, you are very right. I mean, NATO is not the EU, but many members of the EU are members of NATO as well. Only 4 members of the European Union are not in NATO. And also, we have some countries who are not in the EU, but they are in NATO. So it's the big question, first of all, for the EU member states, if they are able to pay double, because they will pay for both, for the state aid, the EU state aid, and for the military aid. So, of course, the governments have very difficult things to discuss. But on the other hand, we also know if Ukraine doesn't win, meaning if Russia will take over these territories, maybe, you know, in a few years it will be worse, and it will cost much more the NATO members to build the right defense.
So it's more about preventing it now than having to cure it later. So it's just removing the symptoms. But when we're talking about financing, there have been some voices, especially in the US, an idea of sorts of taking over the Russian assets, the majority of which happens to be in Europe, and then actually funding part of any sort of scheme that was supposed to help Ukraine. Do you think that this could be somehow part of the plan, or is that a completely separate idea?
Well, it's going parallelly because, of course, it's not an easy thing for the Western culture. You know, we are following laws. We are based on laws and regulations. And, of course, private property is something we are really very careful as far as taking over. And we have to also admit that it could be reactions on that because, well, the West is based on the right to keep assets. So, of course, no one discusses, you know, that Russia did a very, very wrong thing and has to repay to Ukraine. But all these assets in the West, which belong to personal, individual people, have to be verified. And what we agreed upon is to frozen it. It's easier to, you know, get them frozen than to really transmit this money directly to Ukraine. I think what is really quite probable is to let these frozen assets work and take over the percentage over it and then to transmit it to Ukraine. But it's a very complicated legal issue, unfortunately.
And it's a lengthy process as well, I suppose.
And I think, but also coming back on defense and military assets for NATO, I want to just share really briefly, because on this fund, I mean, we need consensus. We have now 32 member states. I mean, nothing happens here without consensus at the end of the day. You mentioned EU countries, non-EU countries. We need that consensus. Now, as this fund was already proposed, we have support by the Polish foreign minister. We have support by the Baltic states, not a big surprise. And of course, if I just want to share a quick tweet for our audience and with you here, surprise, surprise, from Mr. Zoltán Kovács, from the Hungarian spokesperson for Mr. Orbán, who immediately, or he's quoting, I think, Szijjártó on here. You can see that on your screen now. First line is critical. Peter Szijjártó firmly stated Hungary will not back any NATO proposals that might draw the alliance closer to war or shift it from a defensive to an offensive coalition. By the way, also, Mr. Szijjártó, I believe, has had more bilateral meetings with his Chinese colleagues than he's had with really any European partners, I think, at this point in time. So when you see something like this, we need consensus. It's a lot of money. How does this already throw a wrench in the spanner. I know it needs to go to Washington anyway for the summit, but when we see something like this, is this even going to take off?
Well, but that's pretty obvious. I mean, this is not really a surprise to anyone. Hungary was blocking also the EU help for the state, for the continuation of works of the Ukrainian state and administration. And imagine that we are talking now about military involvement. So I think it was pretty expected. However, it is a big question mark now what to do. And of course, in the EU case, we were able within the EU countries to negotiate and somehow at the end convince the Hungarians to agree. In this case, we don't know. It's a lot of money, but it's also a different engagement. So yes, it's true. Even Hungary, a small country of 10 million people, can block it because it's an unanimous decision. Don't forget, in the meantime, we have bilateral agreements. So some of the governments, in any case, help Ukraine, military, Poland included. So I think that's the alternative. If there is no agreement at the NATO level, it will be maybe an agreement at the bilateral talks, and it will be a big support, a big bunch of countries, NATO members, who will definitely support this initiative, also because they don't want to pay more in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
And one thing we were also talking about earlier, this concept, which I'm not a big fan of, Trump-proofing the alliance, Trump-proofing Europe.
These headlines seem to be everywhere these days, especially in the context of the NATO meeting taking place in Brussels this very moment.
But I'm more of an optimist in that sense. And we've discussed this also yesterday, that Trump, very much the first one, selling Stinger missiles to Ukraine back in 2017. But nevertheless, I think one of the objectives also talked about today in Brussels was very much the nature of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, by bringing all of that also far more, almost institutionalizing it into NATO. Do you think that's going to move forward? Is that something possible?
Well, something has to be done. You know, it's not only about the 75 years of NATO, which everybody expects something to happen to stress an importance of this alliance, but it's also a real need. I mean, Ukraine is at war. It's you know, it's a very different situation where you have really inside the country the missiles over you and, you know, the city is destroyed. So we have to understand that it's not about talking, it's about a real war happening. So yes, there is a doubt that we as NATO members can offer Ukraine a membership, but something has to be done. Ukraine lost, you know, every security feeling because there was an agreement guaranteed, by the way, by the US and the UK. And Russia, by the way, in Budapest. And Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons. So now, I mean, NATO, you know, to be treated seriously, has to face the situation where, yes, something has to be offered to Ukraine. If not the membership, then what? So I think for NATO is a very strategic decision because everybody is aware that physically the war is happening in Ukraine in a conventional way. But let's be open, Russia is at war with the West. We don't feel it maybe directly, but we can talk about cyber attacks. We can talk about disinformation war already happening for years.
The spy networks.
Exactly. Poland, by the way, is #1 country in the world as far as number of cyber attacks right now. So we are at war already. And I think NATO feels it that, you know, at that stage, Ukraine is the place, a battlefield. But it's much larger things at stake.
It seems like Ukraine is suffering more in a physical sense when it comes to warfare, but there is more that's going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
So.
But at the same time, I think just briefly towards the end, because I mean, we're waiting for Washington. That's going to be the big summit. At the same time, like from this, the gathering today that's happening there, are you optimistic ultimately of this new gathering, these new ideas? Might be Stoltenberg's last gathering here, actually.
Well, but that's the moment. I think for him is also a very important moment just to launch something which can really work and which is very, very much needed. It's extremely difficult to get there. But I think the fact that already the discussion started, we are talking about 100 billion euros, dollars, it's a huge amount. I think, well, I'm not so pessimistic. I think it may be confronting the situation Ukraine is and confronting the consequences of not giving this help vis-à-vis also the situation in the US and expecting maybe that it can be worse in the US if Trump wins, because then we know from what he says that he's not interested in being in this war anymore. So in this case, yes, NATO has to prepare to deal with that, and NATO to be treated seriously, also by Russia, but also by all the world.
And the members themselves. I mean,
absolutely.
we're all in this game for something, aren't we?
So we are talking about a big shift, because NATO also is talking about a leadership in NATO. I mean, NATO now takes leadership from the US. It's really an interesting shift. They are talking about preparing themselves for the situation where the president of the most important member state in NATO may not be so much interested. So the NATO structure can be, you know, now tested, and also has to be mature enough to continue helping Ukraine despite the situation.
Well, nevertheless, as I said, I think I'm more of an optimist in that regard. Whoever's in the White House will still have some time until then, hopefully, but it means that NATO must come together for sure. We'll have to conclude it there. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.